Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison. I want to welcome you to this session of Humanity Rising as we convene our fourth of 10 sessions on the matter of peace in our time, when peace was a secret. One of the ironies about peace is it's both pervasive and seems one of the most scarce commodities in our world all at the same time. And I'd like to just reflect on that unusual anomaly by way of referencing Yuval Noah Harari, the Israeli historian and philosopher whose books, Sapiens and Homo Deus and 21 Lessons for the 21st Century have been really seminal reading for anyone really wanting to understand the complexities of our world. He's just published his new book called Nexus, which is an examination of this contradiction between human capacity and the reality that we brought the world to the brink of self-destruction. He believes that the core problem is not that we have a depraved nature. There's no sense of original sin in Harari's thinking, but rather we are not organizing our relationship to reality closely enough, that there's always a distinction between the stories we tell ourselves about reality and reality itself as it is objectively observable. And nowhere is that more true than in the world of economics and business, which is the theme that we're going to be delving into today. Tom Eddington made the point on Monday that really it's business and the corporations that rule the world. 1,000 years ago, it was the priest. 500 years ago, it was the king. 300 years ago, it was the scientist. And now it's the corporate executives. The reality of business in a capitalist world is that we are ravishing the planet. We're destroying the ecosystem. We've unleashed climate change to such an extent that whether the human species survives the coming cataclysm is an open, scientifically debated question. And yet the storyline, the narrative that we have about capitalism that is taught to us in the schools and in most of our religious institutions and in the mainstream media is that capitalism is the most effective, greatest economic system in the history of the world. It's brought more abundance and it's an exercise in freedom, and it is the ultimate economic business model. And yet, if you look at this narrative more closely, you find that it's fundamentally flawed in two very existential ways. Free market capitalism, first of all, is based on the erroneous interpretation of Darwin that we're in a dog-eat-dog world where only competition exists. And the capitalists made competition the primary virtue. But the reality is that we're not in a dog-eat-dog world. We're in an evolutionary complex of life in which cooperation undergirds the basic reality of evolving life. And while competition certainly plays a role It is a secondary role, not a primary role. The second fundamental of capitalism and the current global business model is that profits are primary and everything else is subordinate. And in many countries, it's actually illegal for the corporate profit incentive to be in any way modified by boards of directors or CEOs. That's beginning to change, but it is primarily the model that we see around the world. And anything to the contrary is essentially image management, contrived by the corporations to make themselves seem what they really are not. This combination of competition and the primacy of profit is summarized by what Ivan Boesky, the investor, said back in the 1980s, that greed is good. And that is what's brought us to the precipice of destruction, because our narrative about economics and business has very little connection to the reality, the consequential reality of economics and business in our world. And this is one of the reasons that I started with the observation that's undergirding this entire 10-day program about peace. It's all over. Most people live peacefully. And yet it is war and conflict emanating out of the narratives that we tell ourselves that hold supreme and motivate actions that erode the very peace that we seek. I would recommend to everyone to pick up Harari's book. He's brilliant at almost every level, from the acuity of his mind to the clarity of his capacity to articulate complex ideas. And I won't refer to him again, but he really focuses the book on that one issue where he says humanity has got to get the narrative and reality the most closely intertwined, and that is around artificial intelligence. Because when humanity projected carbon-based intelligence, biological-based intelligence, us, into silicon, into computers, we've created something that is beyond our current imagination in terms of consequence. And therefore, the imperative to understand what's really real, as opposed to our fantasies of eternal progress, have never been more urgently necessary. So thank you, everyone, for joining us. And I want to now turn the program over to my good friend and colleague, Dr. Eddington, who will commence our program, and then I'll circle back when Tom brings me back in toward the end.
Yeah, thank you, Jim, and thank you for the opening remarks today. Yesterday was a bit of a struggle for me to build a bridge, but today it's an easier softball to build a bridge into where we're going. And I'd like to start with your comments from Yuval's book, Nexus, because it speaks to, in part, what we were talking about yesterday. And in the context of education, yesterday's conversation, and leading into today's conversation around business. And we spoke yesterday about paradigms. And we live in a shared paradigm about the nature of the world. And historically, to Yuval's writing and your comments, Jim, that paradigms historically have been shaped by leaders, whether it was the priest, the whoever was the dominant force at the time. And absent AI, but just with the introduction of the breakdown of hierarchical systems, the patriarchal systems, with the introduction of the internet, we're now in a place where the dominant paradigm no longer can dictate our narrative. And we're in this very uncomfortable place as a species where the distinction between truth and reality is becoming greater and greater. And it's harder and harder for each of us to understand what is truth. And our reality that historically had been based on the dominant paradigm is being strained. And it's creating the discomfort. It's contributing to the acceleration of the breakdown of society. And it's really important that we understand that history, we understand where we are at this moment in time, and certainly understand the role of business, because as I've shared in the last couple of days, with business running the agenda of the world, there's not a shared motivation and an understanding of the role that they play in the world, the global narrative beyond just the shareholder primacy. And so with those opening comments, I'm going to invite in my dear friend and moderator with me this week and next, Marilyn King. Welcome, Marilyn. Good morning.
Good morning. It's very exciting for me to be here, and that the opening remarks, thank you, Jim and Tom, are about paradigm. Because I almost called my company back in 1980 Paradigm, and it's a word that not many people knew. I'm really glad I didn't. But I have been operating from a paradigm that is different from most people since I was 15 years old. I was seized by the thought that I could be in the Olympics, and it was so crazy that I couldn't speak it because people would dump on it. And as a result of my experience in the Olympic Village and in training for 1980, I was seized by the thought that we could see peace in my lifetime if people thought about peace the way Olympians think about gold medals. And so for those of you that have been with us for the last 3 days and today, you have experienced that I wake up on fire. I wake up excited every day. And I've asked Tom to help me stay grounded because I'm so excited about our guest today. And there is a backstory, and I just want to mention for any of those that just to ground all of us is that I've been teasing people that for me, the frame of our 2 weeks that is entitled When Peace Was a Secret is really about my story of now, is that we're moving to a time when peace is no longer a secret. And it's really the reason why we're doing and using the peace literacy tool of the Peace Wheel created by Pathways to Peace, because it takes a complex idea like peace that most people don't really have their hands around, and breaks it into 8 sectors that allow us to have a conversation and to see it as a potential game plan for how we can see where peace has existed, where it is now, who's doing the systemic change work in each of these areas, and how can we be involved in any or all of those areas. And the other thing I want to say to start us off today is that part of what's challenging for me is that I was a pentathlete. I worked in my hurdle, shot put, high jump, long jump, 800 meters. And I worked with people who were Olympians in each of those areas, but my job was to bring it all together. And as a result of my experience in training for 1980 and being in the Olympic Village, when we were with every race and religion, we lived in peace despite all of our differences. I really grasped the notion from ancient Greece and modern times of Olympians as messengers. And so the message that I felt that I could bring, and that was my job to do at this time, is because of the privilege of that experience in the Olympic Village, the message really is that we can make it. We can make it as a planet and a species, and that we really are, to a degree that most people aren't able to see because of the story that's being told pervasively and the stories that we hold. So I love it that we're beginning today talking about paradigms and frames of reference. But not only is my message that we can make it as a planet and a species, but what you think matters. What you think matters. So that's part of what these 2 weeks are about, is to assist us in examining our thinking and being clear. The difference between, facts and reality and spin and propaganda and the stories that we make for ourselves. So we're all Homo sapiens, which is one who thinks, and up-leveling to Homo sapiens sapien, one who thinks about their thinking. For me, we're all on the peace team. Everybody who wakes up every morning and does their best to try to get along and cooperate is on the peace team. But for me, up-leveling to Olympian thinking, to the Olympic level of how Olympians think, and applying that to peace is what I'm excited about. So I wanted to ask Tom to, and I did ask him to help me, stay very grounded this morning in how we move forward. But I wanted to ask you, Tom, would you flash the Peace is the Only Gold diagram? And this is not something I'm asking people to dive into, or I'm not going to go through and explain, but this is to help us understand why I'm so excited about Michael Mezzatesta today. Because even though I've only come to know him very recently, he is someone who has the ability to think at the systemic change level. But more than that, I'm excited because he seems to have the ability to talk about cross sectors. And what you're looking at right now is what occurred for me when I thought we could see peace in my lifetime. And this was kind of delivered to me. There were 5 different domains. One had to do with content, one about Olympians as messengers, another about how that plays out in the community and how we can use technology and the tools that were created by Pathways to Peace that are about Peace Day, and providing a report card for people so they could see where we've come from, where we are, and who's doing what to be engaged. So I've had difficulty my whole life trying to get people to understand what I'm up to and why I'm so excited. So I was hoping that maybe today we could provide just a very simple example of an organization that has found a way to display information in a wide variety of areas in a way that creates a story that helps people shift their thinking. So I'm hoping that today we'll be able to show maybe even just a short portion of a Gapminder video called The 200 Years That Changed the World. And I encourage you all to get very familiar and have Gapminder become one of your best friends, gapminder.org, because they have a wonderful, playful ability to take information and put it together in ways that help people to think about their thinking. So can we play a bit of that video?
Yes, coming up.
"200 Years That Changed the World," a Gapminder video with Hans Rosling.
It was the last 200 years that changed the world. I will show you in Gapminder world here the situation 1809. Each bubble is a country. The size show the population and the color show the continent. The brown here is West Europe, and you can see from the map for the rest. This axis shows health, life expectancy at birth from 30 years to 80 years. And this axis shows income per person in dollar adjusted for inflation and for purchasing power. 200 years ago, all countries of the world had a life expectancy less than 40 years and had an income less than $3,000. Now I start the world. And you can see that the countries with good statistics, they are jumping up and down. There were famine years, there were better years, and West Europe and North America in industrialization started to grow the economy, but health didn't get much better. And slowly health was getting better. And when we came to a situation about 100 years ago, most of the countries of the world had not improved much. It was only this part of the world that was getting richer and eventually healthier and healthier. And between the First and the Second World War, you can see that the difference between the richest and the poorest in the world is just increasing. It was after the Second World War that most of the countries started to change. The green Arab countries here get richer and richer. China here is getting healthier and healthier. Now economic growth starts in China also. And the Arab countries, the green ones, they get healthier. And here we are today. We have a continuous world from high-income countries with long life expectancy to low-income countries with very low life expectancy. But all countries of the world today has more than, or are estimated to have more than 40 years of life expectancy. And all does not have more than $3,000 per capita. So it means that the world has become healthier and richer, but the difference still is enormous between the richest country and the poorest country. And there are also very big differences within countries, which we cannot show here. But to show how the change came about in a different way, I would like to compare two countries here. I will go back to 200 years ago here. 1809, and I would like to compare the United States with China. Look, 200 years ago, the economy was growing in the United States, whereas it was declining in China, that was dominated by foreign powers. Then health started to improve in the United States, but nothing happened in China. And in fact, it was not until modern China emerged here, 1950, that China really started to improve. That was, of course, the great leap forward. That was what Mao Zedong called it. In fact, it meant a leap downwards. But eventually China got a better health and then started with a fast economic growth and is catching up with the United States. And today, the world looks like this. Some call it a flat world. It's not really flat. But what's meant with that expression is that the middle-income countries here, also called emerging economy, they have now a relatively good health, basic education for all, and some have very good education, are very capable, and they can compete with the high-income country in a completely new way, which we especially see now during the financial downturn. And in 2009, the income will fall in most of the high-income countries. It will be a very tough period for the low-income countries. Perhaps those will be worst hit by the financial downturn, whereas the middle-income countries continue to have economic growth, and the gap between the richest and those in the middle, that will probably shrink quite fast during the next 3 years. Now, you can look at the details of each countries in Gapminder World on our webpage.
So
Thanks for sharing that, Georg.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I wanted to use this, even though it's the data itself is now could be updated by 15 years. But the point in sharing this with you all is about telling a story and the ability to tell a story that takes complex information and has us think anew and think differently. So has Michael been able to join us?
No, Michael, I've been reaching out to him. He hasn't been able to join us, so I'm going to invite Jim back into the conversation, and we'll continue with our focus on the role of business in helping us change the narrative.
Yeah, and I just to allow us to shift into that place. Thank you, Jim, for coming back. Just stepping back again, that your comments early on about reality and perception it's one of the conversations that I've had a challenge with, because people will often say, oh, that's not possible and that's not real. And for those of you who don't know my story, I was training for my third Olympic team in the 5-event pentathlon. I gave myself a year to do with nothing but train for the first time in my life, because I'd always had to go to school and work and train 6 to 8 hours a day. And I wanted to end my Olympic career in 1980, my third Olympic team, 24/7 with nothing to do but train. And very briefly, my car got hit from behind by a truck in November of '79. I wound up a misdiagnosed bulging disc. I thought I'd be better next week, and I'll be in the top 3 at the Olympic trials, and I'm getting better every day. That didn't turn out to be true. I was not able to physically train for 7 months. And I had them give me what's the essence of a Novocaine injection in my back. And I placed second at the Olympic trials for the 1980 Moscow Games. And that is not possible. There were younger, faster, more talented women who were training 6 to 8 hours a day. And I did none of that for 7 months. And yet I beat them all except for one person. That is not possible. There is no way that from a reality-based standpoint that I would have thought, ooh, let me try to not train for 7 months and then compete at the Olympic level. It's just not possible. So for me, when people say, oh, that's not possible, and, let's get based in reality, I tell people, I've been operating from an altered state of consciousness since I was 15 years old. So I'm really looking forward to this conversation. And thanks, Jim, for coming back.
Yeah, so I'd like to just build off of what we've shared so far this morning and what we've talked about this week, to focus specifically on business. And we have this paradigm of the nature of humanity. We've got an evolving network of how people see reality, how people see truth, and for really since it's been around for a couple hundred years, but it was placed on steroids by Friedman when he said that the role of business is business and to make money, and it fundamentally shifted what we started seeing in the 1980s. The focus on making money at all costs. And that was happening simultaneously with businesses taking over the agenda of the world. And so you had corporate raiders like Carl Icahn and others who were focused on making money at the expense of destroying companies, destroying communities, destroying people's lives. And it's only gotten worse over the last 40 years. To a point where we've seen some initiatives like the B Corporation movement. We've got several thousand companies now that are shifting back from a governance standpoint, from a shareholder primacy to a stakeholder perspective. But we still have a long way to go, and there's a tremendous amount of damage being done in the process. And things like this, topics like this conversation we're having today aren't happening in most organizations where they're discussing peace and the role that business can play to enable peace in the world, the role that business can play in shifting the paradigm, shifting the narrative. And so I'll just invite, I'll start with you, Jim, just to invite you in to share your perspective.
If you don't mind, Tom and Jim, let me just put a foundational historical perspective in place from which to have this conversation. That is something that happens for me all the time. Often, no matter what we're talking about, my brain takes a very long-term historical perspective. So in this domain of business and economics, I don't have the kind of information and data. Jim, I'm always so impressed with how your brain is just amazing in terms of what you know, and that little bobblehead that you're in all these different areas and bring this information in. But what I wanted to point to is my long-term historical perspective when I think about this issue in particular. I think back to before we had all of this technology, and I'm talking about radio and television, much less where we are now with AI. But business and economics, from my perspective, was engaged person to person. That was where it all happened. And when you lived in a small environment, a community, a village, a tribe, whatever it might be, there was the highest level of cooperation in order for the entity, the community, to survive. And there was a high level of transparency and accountability. Because if this guy over here is the one who raised the chickens and had the eggs and was engaged with that, everybody knew that this guy over here is the one who sold the sick chickens. And everybody knew that. It was transparent. So you engaged with this person in a way where there was a level of transparency, and the accountability came in terms of, you know, people knowing that. And so his business was impacted by that level of transparency and accountability. And so if we move forward right now, I've been following Transparency International for over 40 years. And I've watched our increased ability to say, we see who you are and we know what you're doing. And we now have an increasing ability to also hold you accountable. And, you know, there's a dance among all of these things. But I'm really interested in your remarks, Jim, and this conversation, Tom, because we're in an era now where something comes across my email. I have no idea who this person is. I have no idea. And I don't have the discernment capabilities from a technology standpoint yet to be able to actually figure that answer out very easily. So I'm really interested in terms of this conversation about where we come from in terms of transparency and accountability in business and economics, and where we are now and the implications of that as we go forward.
Yeah, thank you for that, Marilyn. Where I would like to begin my comments, Tom, is around just reflecting on that little video that we just saw. Because I think there's more than meets the eye and a lot less than meets the eye.
Well,
so what were we told? We were told that, you know, 200 years ago, at the beginning of the 19th century, most countries were huddled, poor, diseased, and probably most of them hungry. And in the last 200 years, boy, we have broken out, living longer, and all is well in the world, if you just saw that, and getting better and better all the time. What is not in that video are three things, which when you put them in, significantly changes the trajectory of that graph. The first is the environmental and human cost of the last 200 years. Yeah, we live longer. Yeah, you know, we are at a higher level of standard of living, at least some of the world is. But we have unleashed an ecological disaster, which, because it wasn't included in the graph, gave us a false narrative about unending progress of capitalist economics. Secondly, that graph doesn't engage in the interiority of people. You know, I grew up in Taiwan in the 1950s. My parents were missionaries. We were really poor. The Chinese kids were really poor. There was no economics in Taiwan. We didn't know we were poor, and we were really happy. Right? As you go up this graph, the happiness quotient in most of those countries erodes. Right now in the United States, stress is so off the charts that the Surgeon General even has recently said that something like 20 or 40% of all parents are too stressed to be good parents, right? So both in terms of the externalities of that graph, environmental destruction, and the corrosion of the interior of this graph, we've got a wasteland. There was a book, and it's called The Anxious Generation. I forget the author, but it's a child psychiatrist who's written this New York Times bestseller book. I was waiting at the bookstore for a friend to have dinner, and I was reading it. And he said two things have happened in the last generation that have devastated the American child. One is during the 80s and 90s, parents became overprotective. And even schoolyards, they took, climbing things down, and they eliminated all kinds of things. They didn't want little Johnny and little Janie to get hurt. Then, starting in 2007, with iPhones, we went from overprotecting our children from the physical environment to underprotecting them in terms of digital technology. And he says the mental illness rates, the cancer rates, are going off the charts among teenagers and people in their 20s and 30s. He says it's astonishing, which brings me to the third point. Anyone who's studied evolution knows that it's continual and then it's catastrophic, right? We're getting set right at this apogee when we think we've got it by the tail to experience a catastrophic system failure if we're not careful. So I raised these issues about this little video because what he said was all true. But what wasn't part of the truth that he was bringing together when added to the narrative cautions us about this notion of material progress as the single greatest arbiter of evolutionary progression. It may not be as true as we think it is. And therefore, conversations like this in books like Harari's that are saying we've got to pay attention much more closely to the comprehensiveness of what's true, rather than tease out one aspect that we like to be true that reinforces our destructive behavior and allows us to rationalize in our own mind what in our hearts we know is a violation and a transgression of limits is actually at the heart of the crisis of modernity.
Yeah, thank you for that, Jim. And I think that's really important because it's content that points to a different context. And that's that's the conversation that we as a species need to be having. And just to pick up on a comment that Connie Baxter Marlowe has posted in the chat, she says the current economic model is based on the problem of scarcity. And I would argue that not only is it based on the problem of scarcity, but it's based on a fundamental business model, which is based on extraction.
Yeah.
And that creates, if you're working from an extraction standpoint or way of seeing, creating a business model, then you will bump up against scarcity. And we're at a point where we've got scarcity in so many places because the extraction model can't be sustained. And we've got to fundamentally shift business models to a generative way of operating as an organization. Generative for the people, generative for the supply chain, generative for the communities they operate in, generative for society at large. And that is a fundamental paradigm shift that addresses some of the context that you were speaking to, Jim.
Yeah.
And your point, Jim, I really, really appreciate, the perspective that you bring. One, I don't really, some of the more recent Gapminder videos, I use this one, not because of the data and whether it's current or not, but the ability to show and tell a story. And I don't necessarily agree that his conclusion is that everything is wonderful because of these two things that have moved. But, I didn't hear him make that conclusion, but, here's the information that he was sharing and the story that he told. But the point I think that's really important that you were making is these were only two threads in the story.
Yeah.
And there are many, many more threads. So when you add the thread of what has happened to the environment, for me, the thread about does it equal happiness doesn't mean that, that because we get here that the happiness quotient in all these places has gone down. That's not my experience. There are many countries that have greater life expectancy and higher per capita income that have really found a way to have cradle to grave and free people up for thinking and creativity and the arts and so forth. So as a species, we do have places on the planet where we can see and what are the threads that you are weaving, not you, Tom, Jim, but what are the threads that we are weaving into our stories that have us get up every day and decide what kind of mindset am I going to have about who I am, what am I here for, and what is it that I can do if I think it's important that 7 generations from now, I would like my children and the children of the world to live in a place that has harmony and balance. So I'm loving the story in terms of our paradigms and what is the story. So my question with people who are here with us today and will be listening is, who is determining what your story is? What is the story that you're operating from? And who's deciding what that story is? For me, thank goodness, it's like I could be in the Olympics. I couldn't let go of that idea. And what I had to do was just eliminate what everybody else was trying to tell me so I could hold on to my story, so I could stay focused on that. And it's the same thing that happened for me because I had the privilege of being in the Olympic Village, seeing these people from countries that were at war with each other, kind of arguing over where'd you find the peanut butter, and all of us getting along. And I saw if these highly competitive people from all these isms, we can live in peace, we can make it. And what you think matters and what you do matters. And now we have the ability to communicate with, using these, right? We can communicate with everyone. We can assist them in understanding. I'm kind of just, this is one of those places where Marilyn has to stay very grounded. But I think because of my influence of Willis Harman, and that global mind change is the fastest way to world peace, and we have the ability to affect global mind change. And that Avon Madison created one day when everybody would look at peace together. And we went from 80 countries 40 years ago to 180 countries now. And that over 3 billion people know that the day exists. We can up-level the effectiveness of Peace Day so that people who care about peace, instead of being dispirited and don't know what to do, that they can be inspired, informed, and engaged. And to break peace into segments that are actionable for people through programs like this. And as we up-level our ability to have this actually delivered to people, simple ways for them to be inspired and informed in systemic change in areas that they think are important. For me, the Peace Wave, which is the third of the important kind of resources that Avon Madison and Pathways to Peace brought together, it's about doing what Olympians do. What is it that Olympians do? When they call my name, I didn't just get up there and run, jump, or throw. I took a big breath. And I had to eliminate all outside distractions because they were about to run the men's 100 meters and a gun was going to go off. but I had to stay focused. I had to quiet my mind from all of the whatever I might be thinking about. And I would go right down to that bottom quiet place. And from that place, all I did was remind myself of my highest aspiration. And then with one more breath, I exhaled, and without another thought, I executed based on that mindset. That I was aligning the passion that I'd been delivered, the way that I've been thinking and training every single day. So we can now do that. That's what the Peace Wave is all about, asking people to pause for peace. That in one breath, you can eliminate all those outside distractions that are coming from everywhere. That you can quiet all of the chatter that's in here and drop into that place of quiet and peace. And then in the next breath, when you step into the world, you know that you are more peaceful. And that's a contribution to the peace team. And that what you're going to do next is probably going to be a little more peaceful than it might have been if you hadn't done that. And then the third place is that you can engage programs like this, where once a year we can give you a report card, and you can find places to be involved in systemic change and be excited about being part of that. So thank you.
I'd like to build off of that, Marilyn. Thank you. And just looking at this, the context of today, the business and economic world that we're living in, and focus our conversation on how do we shift the paradigm? How do we help move business from an extraction model to a generative model? How do we shift the governance? How do we shift from shareholder primacy to stakeholder? And what are some things that we can be doing as individuals and as the collective to support the children who are suffering, to fundamentally change the way that business is operating?
So if you don't mind, let me just read the two paragraphs of our intended guests today, because I think it's a partial answer. By identifying, elevating, and supporting, and then weaving together people like Michael Mezzatesta. And what he says about himself very briefly in his own bio, he says, "I'm an economist and an educator using social media to spread ideas for a better future. My work and videos span the intersections of economics, climate, finance, and culture. My goal is to help people imagine better social and economic systems." When I first looked at his work, he's 850,000 views on one of his videos. We have the ability to take what is available to us. And in terms of, what is the thread that we're working from, it depends. I come from the thread that people are basically good, and they want to be involved in something that makes a difference and is bigger than who they are. And we have the ability to do that now. So that's part of where I come from, is the answer is to engage people who want to live in a world at peace, and to have them easy access to the information and support to be involved in an area that matters to them.
How about for you, Jim?
I think this is very important and very complex reality to grapple with in a way that leads to the redemption that we all seek. The subject is around economics and business in a world being devoured by economics and business. And let me get at the paradigm shift that you're talking with by again referencing Harari, who I just happen to be reading and am very impressed with, as I've indicated before. He says there are two fallacies in the current business model and the political economy largely. One is, he says, we have this faith that the more information we have, the better. And therefore, the corollary is the more technology we can invent, the better. That somehow if you have someone you disagree with, we have this notion they don't believe in climate change. You just got to provide them with more facts. Well, but we know from direct experience that that doesn't work. But we're locked into this worldview that, let me just give you more facts, and then maybe you'll understand what I understand, right? And that if there's a problem, unleash the economic business machine to come up with another widget. Need more widgets. And he says that is what he calls the naive belief in informational technological progress, because that doesn't correspond to the reality of the human psyche. And in fact, the human psyche is very complex and is motivated not by rationality, but by the irrationality of its narratives, which is actually quite a profound point. And I know that that's at the heart of what you're saying, Marilyn, but just to take it in the economics and business domain for a moment, the current discussion on climate change is now being taken over by the fossil fuel industry. We saw that in the COP, Conference of Parties, last year, where the Dubai oil minister was the chairperson, and now we're going to see it in Azerbaijan this year, where the oil minister is again the chair of the conference, and they were just doing oil deals during the COP last year, which gives you a sense of sort of the obscenity of our current situation. And now we've got AI that is beginning to explode out into the world, completely unfettered. There's been some regulations in some countries, but they're anemic, and the companies are just going elsewhere. And the United States has got the least controls, as usual, because of our belief in capitalism. And that is taking us into a existential fragility the human race really has never experienced before. And I say this because not only is the catastrophic system failure upon us, but simultaneously, not only are the extraterrestrials showing up,
Yes.
but we're experiencing at the apogee of our information technology progress, the complete collapse of all the stories we've been telling ourselves. And this is what I wanted to bring in for everybody's consideration. The capitalist story, the democratic story, the story of modernity, the religious stories are all being shattered by the momentum of things getting better and better, worse and worse, faster and faster. And one of the things that they're observing in the young people coming up, and one of the reasons why they're beset with 2/3 of them believing we're doomed, and many of them experiencing all kinds of mental illnesses, is because they have no coherent story.
That's right.
Their stories have all been shattered because they don't know what's true, what's fake news, what's a conspiracy theory, what can be relied on. Taylor Swift is up today, and by next Tuesday, it's somebody else, and the world is completely changed. I mean, what's blowing my mind today, for example, is what's going on in Lebanon, where the Israelis have figured out a way to blow up pagers, blow up computers, blow up cell phones. Marilyn, when you raised your cell phone a few minutes ago, I thought, I hope it doesn't blow up. That is shattering our capacity to even understand the world. It's eroding our capacity to engage in a rational expectation that I'm going to wake up tomorrow morning and the world is going to be like it is today. We no longer have that surety. And in that maelstrom of collapse, there are two vectors that are going to emerge. Either we're going to collectively bring it to an end through an Armageddon because we can't handle the stress anymore, or we're going to experience a monumental breakthrough that can allow and empower the transformation of the human psyche and therefore a whole new world. But in my view, we're getting closer and closer to that point of existential choice because of the collapse of narratives that have sustained us for a very, very, very long time.
Yeah, and I think with all of that being reality, I'd like to bring this back to tie up this conversation in the connection to peace. And so we're seeing businesses that have moved to B Corp so they can address the needs of their shareholders. We've seen increasingly more and more businesses trying to get to net zero to impact their carbon footprint. We're seeing new businesses that are arising that are addressing some of the needs of humanity, with businesses focused on pulling the legacy carbon out of the atmosphere, for example, companies that are focused on organic foods. And so we're seeing some examples, albeit not a lot, but you've got companies like Patagonia and others that are have fundamentally changed their business model, that are taking into consideration the health and welfare of their employees and all of their stakeholders. And the question for me is, how do we support that? How do we accelerate that movement of businesses and these adoption of these new ideas? And where is that going to come from? We're not going to see it coming from government. Government has historically always been reactive. And it tends to come from the consumers or the disruptors.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'll kind of close my remarks, and this is just, I love thinking partners about peace and people who challenge my thinking. And there's a couple things. One, I want to just remind people about the impact of the thread through everything of transparency and accountability. That because we can see now exactly what you said, Jim, who is heading up these, international gatherings of people supposedly focused on good things about the environment, right? So we can now see that. And an increasing ability to hold you accountable. That's a place that deserves more conversation, right? And how do we participate in systemic change that allows us to hold people accountable when we see they're doing things that we might not agree with? Big question. The second thing I think is really important here is understanding that how the mind works, and to your point about how much information is coming at us, and more information is not better necessarily. It's important, to have appropriate and important when one can know anything, it's important to be well informed about things that you care about. And how do you discern the information that's available to you? And I think it's important for all of us to understand and remember that this that's sitting inside my head does not have the ability to process all of that. And what the mind does is that we operate from belief systems. And when the incoming does not agree with our belief system, we come up with an excuse for, oh, I don't have to think about that, or that's not true, or that's a conspiracy theory. And we let in information that confirms what we already believe. So it's important for us to be looking at our belief systems in terms of the narrative. And the last thing I would leave in terms of, what do we do? I shared this the other day, the ubiquitous stop sign and doing what Olympians do. So what do we do? It's like Eddie Hart. His drop down place was everything had to line up with being the world's fastest human. What is it that your whole day has to line up with? So the stop sign for me is that do what Olympians do. Stop, take a breath, and the O is for Olympian. Think, what is your world's fastest human? What is your we could see peace in my lifetime? And then when you proceed, you will be operating from that, from your deepest, highest aspiration. So thank you, Jim, for the platform and the conversation today.
Yeah, let me build on that, because I think, Marilyn, you're making a very important point for our time. I think you're right, Tom, that it's going to be either the consumer or the disruptors that are going to, and in my view, a combination of both. But in this moment where there are no prevailing narratives, in this moment of both breakdown and breakthrough, for me, it's the most extraordinary moment in all of human history to be alive.
Exactly.
Right? Sure, the Israelis are blowing up cell phones, and I'm using my cell phone to build peace. I mean, so I'm making existential choices. And I think that's what's so exciting to me about Humanity Rising, about Ubiquity University. Let me give you an example. A couple of us were sitting around the other day and thinking, what could we do to increase disclosure? And we thought, why don't we convene a global disclosure day on October 20th, where people all over the world will convene watch parties, and let's do a 2-hour Zoom extravaganza where we get Lou Elizondo and Ross Coulthard and Danny Sheehan and all these luminaries from the UFO world and activists around the world and so forth and so on, and got excited, and I did a little did-you-do, and off we went. And we put out a little social media announcement, and in 24 hours, we got nearly 500,000 hits.
Yes.
People in over a dozen countries said, I talked to a guy in Brighton in England today who heard about it, God knows how, found my email and said, I want to set up a watch party. So all of a sudden, out of just Olympian thinking in Marilyn's terms, wouldn't it be cool if setting an intention, proceeding, we're launching the first ever global movement like Earth Day? And let me give you the kicker. I pulled the date right out of the air. Right? I wasn't even thinking about it. I didn't find out till after we had announced it that it turns out that October 20th is the date set in the legislation passed by the U.S. Congress when it passed the Unidentified Anomalous Phenomena Records Collection, that by October 20th, 2024, all government agencies and all contracting corporations had to turn over all the information they've got about UFOs. So we, in answering the call,
yes,
turned out we were completely synergizing
yes,
with the historical moment. And we may be launching on October 20th, the ET equivalent of Earth Day. And it's taking shape all over the world.
yes.
So this is important, everybody.
Yes.
Because in the absence of a prevailing paradigm, people are more susceptible to something that's becoming an attractor. And it might as well be us. It might as well be peace. It might as well be our cosmic moment. It might as well tuning into Humanity Rising. So for me, I'm aware, as I think most of you know, acutely aware of the dangers of our time and the evil that's prevailing in our time. But I'm deeply committed and more aware of the potential for human goodness as the breakdown gives all the energy required for the breakthrough. And if I could just add one note on this. This is physics. This isn't fantasy. This is Prigogine, who won the Nobel Prize in chemistry back, I think it was in 1996, and was one of the theoreticians for chaos theory. What he learned is that underlining all chaos is a deeper coherence. And it's the capacity of people to tap into that deeper coherence through the competitiveness, to the cooperation, through the conflict, to the peace that allows them, he said, to start to create islands of coherence in the sea of chaos. And the islands of coherence aren't separate from the chaos. They're actually using the energy of the chaos for coherence. And once there's a critical mass of them, the chaos uplevels an octave to a new level of coherence. That's the basic process going on in the world right now. And we get to be part of it. And that's a source for me of deep, deep joy and excitement at just simply being alive in this kind of an opportunity where every choice we make makes a difference.
And just to clarify, Jim, on the disclosure day, are you focused just on, or will the day be focused just on UAP disclosure, or is it an invitation for people to do disclosure of things in their personal life?
Oh no, this is
their
just
organizational life.
This is UAP disclosure as a specific focus. I'm sure people can participate at all kinds of levels, but just like Earth Day is a celebration of the Earth, this is a celebration of a humanity's entry into our cosmic moment when we are coming into incontrovertible fact-based awareness that we are not alone. And we have the opportunity to embrace this moment rather than responding with fear.
Yeah, I would just invite you to expand the day, because we've got a paradigm that we're all living in that we know isn't sufficient. It's not supportive of human life on planet Earth. We're all living in, not from a moralistic or ethical perspective, but we're all living in and showing up in the world in a place of lacking integrity.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I'm using integrity from a perspective or a definition of, like, we think about a building having structural integrity. And we're out of integrity with the earth. We're out of integrity with each other. We're out of integrity with ourselves.
Yeah.
And so imagine if the disclosure wasn't just about UAP, but it was disclosure about where we're out of integrity with ourselves, with each other, with planet Earth. And imagine if everybody shows up to disclose something where they're out of integrity, or they're not showing up in the way they intend to be showing up.
Yeah,
So
great idea.
I see them both. You know, the focus, Jim, I'm so excited about, and the importance of the way you just described disclosure. Both really, really very powerful.
Totally.
Yesterday, Tom called me to task when I referenced broken systems, and systemic change and dealing with broken systems was really important and appreciated, because I use that when I'm looking to be succinct, and what I really, how I feel about it has to do with systems that are not serving us, for 7 generations. But to that point, I'd like everybody who's paying attention here, I have a very personal relationship to how often I hear people contrast cooperation and competition. Like cooperation is where we need to go, and competition is not a good thing. You're looking at somebody who competed at the highest level with the very best in the world. And I really want people to understand that there are people who operate competitively from a win-lose situation. That exists. And I don't think that that's a very healthy way to come from. And people succeed, just villainizing the other one and coming from that win-lose place. But I want you to know that's just one story about competition.
Mm-hmm.
When I was trying to make my first Olympic team, and Jane Frederick, who always jumped higher than me, didn't do that well that day, and I was trying to up-level my competition and make it to the Olympic team the first time, I walked over to Jane and I said, "What are you doing? What happened? What's the matter?" It's like I counted on her to continue to be jumping because it inspired me to jump higher, right? And now I was by myself trying to make an Olympic team with nobody there. And I remember being on my first Olympic team at the Olympic Games and watching the Russian and the American in the 100 meters in the final cross the finish line. And before they had even slowed down, these two men turned and embraced one another. And when I talked to my friend, he said, what he said to him is, "I would not be this good if it weren't for you."
Mm.
We can use competition to aspire to be our very best selves.
Absolutely.
So number one, I would like people to really pay attention when they hear the contrast of we need to move from competition to cooperation, maybe a certain kind of competition. And the other thing, just to underscore, what you're saying about the chaos, to order situation. I talk about Olympian thinking as a framework for understanding exceptional human performance, and I call it passion-powered, vision-guided, action-oriented. And when any one of those three things is missing, it's a deal breaker, right? You can be passionate and clear, and anyway, any one of those three, it's a deal breaker. But I really am up-leveling my own willingness to expose who I am and what I'm really up to, Jim, because at a certain point I realized all I've done was discover through my own journey the perennial wisdom, which is body, mind, and spirit, right? And is the spirit that guides me. It is my mind that I endeavor to align with that greater wisdom so that my everyday action plays itself out. And I believe in the goodness of humankind and that we are about to have the breakthrough, because we, all over the world, people have the ability and endeavor to align body, mind, and spirit for 7 generations' benefit.
Totally. Beautiful. Beautiful. So Tom, what's going on for tomorrow, or any kind of closing comments you'd like to make? But tell us about tomorrow.
Yeah, I'd like to just focus for a moment on our conversation today, and I'm disappointed we lost our panelist Michael, because it would have been great to have his contribution to this conversation. But I would say beyond that, it's been a terrific series of conversations this week, where we're touching on each of the dimensions of what will contribute to the shifting of the paradigm of the reality that we are living in a peaceful world, and that the vast majority of the 8 billion people on the planet do live in a world of peace. And we'll be speaking more to that tomorrow when we focus on health and relationships. and have an opportunity to look at another dimension of the 8 sectors that contribute to world peace.
Good. Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Marilyn. You can join Tom and Marilyn in the after chat. You'll see the link in the chat box, and you received it in your Zoom reminder. And the wheel of peace will continue to turn, and tomorrow will be on well-being and relationships. Thank you, everyone. See you tomorrow. Bye for now.
Thank you.